Imagine the small negative utility produced by a speck of dust falling in someone's eye. And then imagine the negative utility produced by someone being tortured for 50 years. Quite the difference. A critique of utilitarianism goes like this. Since in a utilitarian framework we merely add utility up, we know that there is a huge number of people, maybe billions of billions, such that if they all had a speck of dust fall in their eye, the sum of all the negative utilities caused by the dust specks would be a very large number. And by increasing the number of people that get the dust in their eye, we can make this large number as big as we want. Thus, no matter what number we choose to represent the suffering a single person can experience by being tortured 50 years, there will always be an incredible large number of people for which getting a speck of dust in their eyes will result in a bigger amount of negative utility in magnitude. So if we were to choose between an incredibly huge amount of people getting a speck of dust in their eye, or a single person being tortured for 50 years, the utilitarian framework seems to tell us that if the amount of people that get a dust speck in their eye is big enough, it would be better to choose to torture a single person. To most people, this appears wrong, since no amount of persons getting dust in their eyes can make up for an individual being tortured for 50 years. This counterexample is usually named hangnails for torture, since in its original form, instead of specks of dust, it used hangnails. We don't like visualizing hangnails, so we chose to utilize specks of dust instead. Whatever. More importantly, the theme of this counterexample is closely related to another one that sometimes takes its name from its author, Dostoevsky. Indeed, in the book The Brothers Karamazov, a moral dilemma is posed based on whether there exists an amount of aggregate happiness one could exchange for the torture of a single child. The subject matter is related to the specks of dust example, since what both settings are getting at is that there are some forms of suffering that we should never accept, that are so abhorrent that nothing can compare to them. Okay, so how can a utilitarian deal with these counterexamples? We will see the two main ways that have been explored in the literature. The first is by questioning whether our moral intuitions may be wrong when judging the examples, thus denying that the examples are counterexamples in the first place. Point in fact, we know from empirical investigations that our intuitions when dealing with extremely big numbers are suspect to say the least. For example, we struggle to conceptualize large distances without some kind of visual aid, and even then our intuitive grasp is feeble at best. So one could wonder why we should trust our moral intuitions when applied to the counterexample at hand, given that it deals with comparing a huge amount of suffering with a huge amount of people. This was the idea of John Broome in his book Weighing Lives, where he wrote the following. We have no reason to trust anyone's intuitions about very large numbers, however excellent their philosophy. A compelling argument. A corrective for our moral intuitions is proposed by Alasdair Norcross. By imagining a life that had a number of years of torture in it, but was still worth living. For example, one might be willing to live 2 years of torture if the rest of his life was 498 years of bliss. If one is willing to accept such a life, then there must be a quote-unquote exchange rate between extreme pain and happiness. Thus, years of torture may be not totally uncomparable to other types of happiness or suffering. Along the same lines, but in a different note, Jan Gustafsson argues that the problem in our moral intuition isn't merely the largeness of the numbers. Rather, it's the fact that if our moral intuitions have even a slight measurement error regarding an amount of suffering or happiness, then the error is compounded many times by the large numbers, rendering our intuitions unreliable. All in all, it appears that there are serious reasons to believe that our moral intuitions could be mistaken when judging the setting. Now, onto the second rebuttal, that instead accepts our moral intuitions as being correct in saying that some kinds of sufferings cannot be exchanged for anything. Indeed, there might be something fundamentally more important in preventing suffering than pursuing pleasure. This is the thought of negative utilitarians, who instead of maximizing happiness, would rather minimize suffering. There are compelling arguments for this asymmetry between suffering and happiness. For instance, Karl Popper writes that human suffering makes a direct moral appeal, namely the appeal for help, while there is no similar call to increase the happiness of a man who is doing well anyway. So it seems like we should at least have a contingency plan, in case our moral intuitions are correct when evaluating the counterexamples we are discussing. Without adopting negative utilitarianism that would solve some problems and create others, there is another way to incorporate the different status of suffering in a utilitarian framework, by introducing distinct values to quantify dreadful sufferings. This is usually done through a lexicographic ordering. That is, by introducing thresholds, above which a suffering is considered markedly different than other pains. With such an ordering, the suffering produced by torture could be made incomparable to the one given by a dust speck falling in our eye. A similar effect may be obtained by using ordinal numbers. Taking a model for utility, we have the eudaimonic function that caps happiness from above, but leaves suffering unbounded from below. Thus, we can already categorize certain sufferings as having the value minus infinity. In this way, no finite sum of lesser pains, such as the ones caused by dust specks, can be exchanged for certain types of suffering. So great! Classifying long periods of torture as being valued minus infinity, we seem to align our moral intuitions with both the dust speck and the Dostoevsky counterexample, since now no trade-off is acceptable for a single person's immense suffering. But we have a problem. What if we were to choose between a single person being tortured for a long time and two persons being tortured for the same time? We would categorize them both as minus infinity, although we would like to say that the two persons being tortured is obviously worse. Enter ordinal numbers. Ordinal numbers are an extension of the natural numbers that are used to describe a way to arrange a possible infinite collection of objects in order one after another. Without getting too rigorous, ordinal numbers are quite easy to grasp intuitively. If we utilize the symbol infinity for the first infinite ordinal, then add in another infinity, we would have 2 times infinity, that is greater than only infinity. They work as one would expect. So allowing the eudaimonic function to take values in the ordinals, we could now categorize 2 long tortures as minus 2 times infinity. This remedies the issue where we could not distinguish between extreme levels of suffering. With this, we have defined happiness in such a way that it aligns with our moral intuitions, at least regarding the counterexamples under scrutiny. Great. Now, these kinds of solutions may seem patchworky or unelegant. We understand the feeling, but it all just goes to show how the utilitarian framework is more flexible than one might initially suspect, and that it is a work in progress. One should probably not fall dogmatically in love with one version or another, or be worried of adjusting his theory if new and more compelling arguments present themselves. Okay, so with this we have given 2 possible answers to the hangnails or dust specks for torture counterexample. Some cultured viewers might recognize that in some ways the hangnails for torture counterexample resembles yet another popular one, the repugnant conclusion. But that will be a subject for another video.